So thank you so much for that great presentation, Siobhan. And Siobhan actually touched on the topic that I will really discuss here today, and that's that of the justice needs of victim survivors. So I will clarify what is that actually justice needs. And I will do this by considering the perspectives of victim survivors who have gone through a justice process. Because my research took place in a very different setting to the ones discussed by Siobhan and by most of the other presentation that I saw on sexual violence yesterday, I will briefly contextualize my research to point out differences, but to also highlight that we can learn from justice processes in other settings. So my research really focused on what we call conflict-related sexual violence. And this is sexual violence that is committed in a conflict or post-conflict setting with some link to the conflict itself. It's distinct in terms of its scope and scale and the level of brutality. It frequently involves mass sexual violence and extreme brutality, so acts like rape, gang rape, sexual torture, and sexual slavery. It may be committed with the intent to seriously harm or even destroy the other or the whole group of people. It may be committed by both men and women against women, men, transgender people, and children. But most acts of conflict-related sexual violence are perpetrated by male people against women, and that's why my research also focused on that type of conflict-related sexual violence. As I noted, this is a different setting, but I really understand that there's so much we can learn from these experiences, and I've spoken to other people who said there's so much in here. I would love to hear from you afterwards what you thought resonated most with your work. So my research more specifically took place or focused on sexual violence committed during the genocide against the Tutsi, which took place in 1994. And the genocide was characterized by its widespread, systematic, and extremely brutal use of sexual violence. An estimated 500,000 women were raped during the genocide, and this is only the women who ended up surviving. So there were up to 800,000 people killed, and many of the women who were killed were also raped prior to that. Many of the women were raped by people known to them because of the mass participation of the Hutu population in the genocide against their Tutsi neighbors, which meant that once the genocide finished, many of the victim survivors lived in the same communities as their perpetrators, they were often even extended family members. So while such a large group of women were raped, only around 7,000 women ended up raising their case or having the case tried at one of the local community courts, which I will explain in some more detail now. So these courts were called gacaca, and they were established by the Rwandan government in the aftermath of the genocide to deal with genocide-related crimes. They were meant to combine Rwanda's more traditional conflict resolution system, which drew mainly from restorative justice approaches, with a more modern retributive justice system. Gacaca was embedded in a broader approach to what is called transitional justice. Some of you may have heard about the ICTR, so the International Tribunal for Rwanda, and some cases were tried here as well, but most sexual violence cases were tried at gacaca. I will talk a little bit about the special features of gacaca, and it's very different to what we know from our setting here, and I will point out some of the differences. And I will focus on those that dealt with sexual violence, because gacaca dealt with other genocide-related crimes as well. Now, the ones that dealt with sexual violence, they were all held by or led by lay judges, so they had not received any formal university legal education. They received a 6-week crash course in gacaca law and another 6 weeks to really learn about how to handle traumatized individuals and learning about sexual violence. So again, the specific training was needed to sensitize them to the topic. Sexual violence cases, as opposed to other gacaca hearings, so gacaca was normally heard in public because it was meant to contribute to reconciliation of the whole Rwandan population. The ones that dealt with sexual violence were heard in camera, and this meant that attending were the 5 to 7 judges, the accused, the victim survivor, a support person for the victim survivor if available, and witnesses were available. There was no legal representation, neither for the accused nor for the victim survivor, but it was expected that they would speak for themselves. Direct interactions between the accused and the victim survivor were encouraged, or at least permitted, but in many cases they were also encouraged. Again, this was meant to contribute to reconciliation. Now, the retributive element of gacaca was its sentencing scheme. And rape and sexual torture were actually considered as one of the most serious crimes committed during the genocide, and they were also sentenced with the harshest sentences possible, ranging from 20 years to life imprisonment and solitary confinement, depending on whether confessions or apologies were given. So again, perpetrators could reduce their sentence by confessing and apologizing, but couldn't reduce it any less than the 20 years. Now, for my research, I interviewed 23 Rwandan victim survivors in semi-structured interviews who had experienced sexual violence during the genocide, who had raised their case somewhere between 2002 and 2006, who had their case tried between 2008 and 2012, and my interviews took place in 2015, 2016. Because I didn't speak Kinyarwanda, which is the language of Rwanda, I had an interpreter with me, and I also audio recorded these interviews, and afterwards the recordings were transcribed and translated, and I analyzed those translations. Now, for you to understand the experiences and the justice needs of these women, it's really important to understand first what their genocide experience was, and I will do this very briefly. So at a minimum, each of the interview was raped by one perpetrator. Many were raped by multiple perpetrators at multiple occasions across the genocide, which lasted 100 days. Many were also otherwise physically assaulted, many lost property, and all of them lost family members. One of my interviewees lost her husband and all her 7 children. Now back to the consequences that resulted just from the sexual violence. This included physical consequences, such as direct physical injuries from the sexual violence, sexually transmitted diseases such as HIV, unwanted pregnancies, and just chronic pain. They suffered psychologically, including severe trauma, PTSD, shame, and anxiety. They suffered socially, including stigma, which then again led to community and family ostracism. And because of all of that, they suffered economically. They were unable to engage in physical labor following the genocide because of the rest of the consequences, and this is what they had relied upon before the genocide. So they were unable to engage in labor, unable to feed their families, unable to pay for their children's school fees. Now, again, to understand the experiences with the process, I need to give you a little bit of information about how the process actually worked and what happened. So the 23 women had accused altogether around 100 perpetrators, because many of them had been raped by numerous perpetrators. Out of those, 77 participated in the trial. The rest, or at least 30, were tried in absentia. Some couldn't be tried at all. Now, out of the 77 who participated, 75% denied all allegations. The other 25% confessed, apologized, or they first denied, and once they were convicted, they then confessed, hoping that they could reduce their sentences. So, and this experience of seeing their perpetrators deny everything actually had a significant negative impact on the victim survivors. And we spoke, or Siobhan spoke before about the need for screening. There was no screening at gacaca. So every case that a victim survivor had raised and wanted to be tried was tried. Now, in terms of the verdicts, and this is quite interesting, and this shaped the justice needs and the experiences of these victim survivors was that only one perpetrator was acquitted. So the majority, the large majority, received the maximum penalty of life imprisonment. Some received reduced sentences because they had confessed or apologized. Now, I looked at my interviews to make sense of what are the justice needs of victim survivors. And what I found was that they could be distinguished in two categories, and that's process-related justice needs, so how a process should be designed to meet the needs of victim survivors, and outcome-related justice needs. And here I don't mean the final verdict, but all the psychological changes that such a well-designed process may encourage or support. And I will talk about the outcome-related justice needs to start with, including truth, consequences, perpetrator responsibility, safety, validation, vindication, reparation, and empowerment. And I will talk to these in more detail now. So the first one was, as I noted, truth. And this had two components, one of them being truth-telling, which was valued for a number of reasons. And one is nicely illustrated by the quote by Solange, who was raped in front of her two children. She noted, "My aggressor was a pastor. He was disguising as a good person, and I wanted to expose him in front of God." So for most interviewees, this exposure element, to show this is a perpetrator and this is what he has done, was the most important reason for why they wanted to tell the truth. Another reason for why truth-telling was valued is nicely represented by this quote by Odette, who had been raped multiple times by one perpetrator. She noted, "I wanted to share my pain with other people. I wanted the people to understand that I have gone through a lot." So in this sense, it was more about personal catharsis and being heard by an audience that mattered. Another element of truth, as I categorize it, is truth-seeking. And this relates to victim survivors having questions about their victimization, wanting to find out why they were targeted, wanting to find out what had happened because they may not be able to recall what actually happened. And this is nicely presented by this quote by Celine, who had been kept as a wife by several perpetrators across the 100 days of the genocide. She said, "I just wanted to know those people so that I could ask them why they did what they did to me." So truth-seeking wasn't important for all of the interviewees, but for some, it was the reason why they had decided to participate in the process. They wanted to ask these questions. Consequences was another topic discussed by nearly all interviewees, and they were very firm around that consequences needed to happen. As pointed out by Florence, who had been sexually tortured by a large group of strangers, "I always thought that whenever I knew who had hurt me, I was going to make sure that they'd pay for it." Now, there were different thoughts as to what paying for it might mean. And again, this led me to categorize firstly the formal state punishment, as supported by gacaca, and alternative consequences, which may involve, for example, exposure, depriving somebody of undeserved honor and privileges, or having to pay reparation to make amends for the harm. However, in the context of gacaca, the interviewees predominantly valued formal state punishment. As pointed out by Petronille, who had been raped in public by two perpetrators from her community. And she said, "I wanted him to be captured and be put into prison. I wanted to see him suffer with my own eyes the way he made me suffer in the bushes." So quite a retributive understanding of justice. And this is actually a point of difference I found between my research and research in settings such as Australia or the US or Canada, where I frequently read that formal state punishment was not actually so highly valued. By these interviewees, it was. And there are some reasons for that, and one of them is that I think it helped them to have some of the other justice needs met, such as safety, which I will talk about a little bit later. Perpetrator responsibility, another topic discussed by nearly all interviewees. As Monique pointed out, who was raped by 3 perpetrators, I wanted people to confess to their crimes and agree to what they had done. I wanted people to tell the truth and own up to their crimes. So this shows really the broad range of how perpetrators may take responsibility. They may confess, they may tell details about what has happened, and this comes out in this quote, but really the most accepted and sought after form of perpetrator responsibility for the interviewees was a request for forgiveness or an apology. As pointed out here by Ella, who had been raped by a man from her community, and she said, "What I wanted was for him to ask me for forgiveness in front of the authorities so they could be aware of it." So not only was it important to be asked for forgiveness or hear an apology, this ideally happened in public so that other people would see too. And this again was to have some of their other justice needs met, such as safety, which I will talk about now. And safety was so important, especially for those victim survivors who were living in the same communities as their perpetrators, as pointed out here by Emily, who had been raped by a man from her community. And she said, "We were neighbors and I would cross paths with him all the time and feel terrified. One day something happened in my heart and I thought to myself that I should not continue to live in fear," which is why she then went to raise her case. Validation and vindication was a theme discussed. I really had to sort of analyze a lot to uncover this, because it wasn't so, they couldn't necessarily specify this, but it really came out through the interviews how important these justice needs were. And this really, what it means, validation, vindication, is the acknowledgement that the victim survivors' stories are believed, that they were indeed seriously harmed and that the harm had an impact on them, and that sexual violence is wrong and a crime. And this was really important in the Rwandan context, because frequently victim survivors felt that their sufferings had not been taken seriously. Pointed out here by Valentine, who had been raped publicly by her neighbor's sons, who had previously been friends with her own son. So she said, "People would ridicule me and make me feel like having been raped was my fault. People finally got to realize that rape was a serious crime and that it was punishable by law." So here we can see why the formal state punishment was so important. It gave them this assurance, yes, you were harmed, this was serious, it deserved a serious sentence. Then looking at reparation, and in the context of sexual violence, the most common form of reparation is financial compensation. And this would have been so important in the context of Rwanda because of the material harm suffered by the interviewees, the consequences that I discussed previously, their inability to actually continue with any physical labor. Unfortunately, gacaca did not facilitate reparation. So this is the main shortcoming, as I identified, of gacaca, pointed out here by Emily, who had been raped by numerous perpetrators and who was infected with HIV. Nothing was done about our reparations. We've lost our families, and even though we survived, we're still struggling because of what happened to us. So her perpetrators were sentenced, but because there was no reparation, she didn't feel like justice had really been done. Finally, looking at the final outcome-related justice needs, empowerment, which relates to overcoming feelings of fear, intimidation, and humiliation, which is so typical for the crime of sexual violence and people and traumatized individuals. And really at gacaca, there were so many different opportunities for empowerment, being allowed to tell their story about rape, being heard by an audience that mattered, witnessing their perpetrator either being sentenced or apologizing. So all these were opportunities for empowerment. Even just the decision to raise their case and have it tried, because in Rwanda, it was up to the victim survivor to decide whether they wanted their case tried or not. And one interview said Anita, who had been raped by several perpetrators, she also lost her husband and 8 of her 11 children, said, "It was so hard to stand alone and accuse them. I was brave enough to do it, and the people in my village nicknamed me the Beast because they wouldn't have had the courage to do what I did." So raising their case and going through the process was seen as an act of courage. And I think this was just really so important, and to work with this empowerment was really helpful for interviews like Anita. I will now go to looking at the design of the process. How can a process support the experience of justice? And what I found through my interviews was one element that can contribute is an enabling environment, meaning respectful treatment by authorities and supportive features. Opportunities for participation, having some sort of say in the process, contributing to the process and the final outcome, having a voice. And finally, information as to what their options may be and what sort of outcomes the process may produce, as well as support, psychological support and advocacy. And I will talk to some of them in more detail, but not to all of them. Before, however, I would like to reiterate why it is so important to look at the process when it comes to dealing with sexual violence. So I noted before, the violence took place in 1994, the trials took place in 2008, so 14 years between. And still at the time of the trial, the women spoke about how highly at risk they were of being re-traumatized during the process and how fragile their mental state was. Pointed out here by Valentine, who had been raped by her neighbor's sons. We spoke about her before. She said, "I still did not feel human yet at that point. I had been stripped of my humanity." Patience, who had been raped by multiple perpetrators right in front of her community, said, "I did not feel like I was a person. I felt like I was some other creature, but not a human being." And again, understanding this fragile mental state when victim survivors go into a process is just really important, and I think highlights, we had the discussion here before, that staff need to be trained to know about this. And this brings me to the next point, the importance of supportive treatment by authorities. So at gacaca, these were the judges who heard the cases. At a restorative justice process, this might be conveners or other people participating in the process. At a criminal justice process, it might also be the judges or the legal representatives. And supportive treatment really means to be treated with respect, with care and sensitivity. And the interviews noted how important this experience with the authorities were for their gacaca experience overall. And luckily, the experience was quite positive. As I noted, the staff had seen some trauma training before hearing any cases. And Anita had pointed out the jury or the judges listened to me carefully and they gave me some time to catch my breath whenever I got emotional. And this was really important for her gacaca experience overall. Now, looking at how an enabling environment may be created through supportive procedures, including but not limited to privacy and safety. And I will actually now focus on the procedure, the gacaca procedure, that victim survivors had to be present and that they had to speak for themselves in most cases. So we're going to see a quote by Odette, who had been raped multiple times by one perpetrator while she had her baby on her back. And this was one of the most traumatizing experiences throughout the genocide. And she said, at her trial, when I got into the courtroom and saw the defendant, I almost felt sick. And I stepped back outside. I didn't want to look at him because it reminded me of my situation back then, and that brought me a lot of sorrow. I was traumatized by seeing that person again because it was the first time ever since the day he raped me. So for Odette, having to meet her perpetrator in Rwanda, these courtrooms were really tiny, was not what I would consider a supportive procedure. However, while this was so incredibly difficult, also for loads of other of the interviewees, some of them actually saw this as a very important opportunity afterwards to witness perpetrator responsibility, to witness their perpetrators being sentenced, being able to ask questions. So for some, while it was extremely difficult, it was also extremely important in hindsight. Some even participated only because they wanted to confront their perpetrators. So I guess what I'm trying to say is how important it is to listen to what is important for the individual survivor and be flexible with the procedures. Advocacy and support were discussed as another really important thing. And as I had noted previously, victim survivors could be supported by a trauma counselor. And this support was, again, incredibly important for their gacaca experience overall. As Alice noted, the one thing that made me stronger was seeing those trauma counselors, because I knew that they were going to be there to help if I was not doing well. It helped me feel strong and tell my story without fear. So she actually said she wouldn't have been able to participate if she hadn't had this support. Marie noted, "I'm thankful that the government thought about having some trauma counselors who were always there for us and went home with you in case you had a trauma episode. They helped us through our pain." And I think this is a really important point, that they went home with them. There was an after process care. So it was not just important to be supported during the process, but also afterwards, which brings me to my last point, where I would like to point out an initiative that the interviews participated in that followed the gacaca process. So this is not linked to gacaca itself, and it is important to acknowledge that a justice process is only one part along the road to recovery and healing and can only do that much, and it's so important to pick up after that. So I want to briefly talk about the therapeutic groups that the interviews participated in. And half of the interviews were already in such a group at the time that I interviewed them. The other half could join such a group after the interviews because I could connect them to the counselor who was running those groups. And just looking at some of the quotes of these women about their group, saying, Marie said, who had raped multiple times by the same perpetrator who also killed her baby. She was then, after the genocide, left by her husband and shunned by her children because of the rape that she had experienced. And she said, the good thing about my current life is that I have a support group. And a support group made of people who have gone through the same experience as me, a group of people who can relate to my experience. Or Valentine, who said, being part of the group has restored our desire to live. We got to hear some testimonies from other people which were similar to ours, and it always helps to know that you're not the only one. So again, pointing out how important this connectedness with other victim survivors is to actually help them with their recovery. And this is something that had been pointed out by Judith Herman in her book, Trauma and Recovery. Anyone who has read that, she actually speaks at length about the need to reconnect with others who have gone through something similar. So wrapping up my presentation, giving you a very brief overview again, how I have conceptualized the justice needs of victim survivors, distinguish them as looking at the process and looking at the outcomes. And again, I'm keen to hear what you think and if some of them resonate more with you than others. And just very briefly, pointing out the main research implications for the setting, like here in Australia, I would say, to understand the psychological challenges and the risk for re-traumatization of victim survivors at the time of when they participate in a process. The diversity of justice needs and preferences, both in terms of the process and the outcomes, such as wanting to see the perpetrator, not wanting to see the perpetrator, wanting punishment rather than accountability or perpetrator responsibility, and just acknowledging the diversity in creating flexible processes. The need for training for authorities to handle traumatized victim survivors, specifically in the space of sexual violence. The value of having a trauma counsellor to accompany victim survivors before, during, but also after a justice process. The benefits of discussing opportunities for empowerment, perhaps by the trauma counsellor with the victim survivor. And finally, thinking about initiatives beyond a justice process that may, again, support recovery and healing of victim survivors, such as the therapeutic groups that I just spoke about. That's it. I would like to thank you for listening. I would like to thank those interviewees for sharing their stories with me, which helps us to think about these stories and see what we can learn from them for our context. Thank you very much.